You don't know a thing about me, I spat, my fingers trembling as they gripped the edge of the cafe table, the quiet jazz music contrasting with the tension vibrating between us. His eyes, strikingly calm against my storm, though perhaps with a flicker of remembered pain I hadn't noticed before, never left mine. Maybe not, he replied, his voice soft, carrying the cadence of his distant home. But I know you're hiding. 3 weeks earlier, we'd been strangers. Now this person who should mean nothing was somehow peeling back layers I'd spent years carefully constructing, defenses built against judgments I feared more than anything. The afternoon sunlight cast shadows across his knowing expression. How does someone you barely know see through the identity you've crafted? The one designed to keep you safe, unremarkable, unnoticed in the ways that truly matter? I wasn't ready for the answer, but the pull towards him, towards the terrifying possibility of being seen, kept me rooted to my seat. I couldn't walk away. You're hiding. His words hung in the air between us, a quiet challenge I wasn't prepared to face. Before speaking, I saw a flicker cross his face, hesitation perhaps, or the shadow of his own past battles. This wasn't easy for him either. The cafe around us continued its afternoon rhythm. The hiss of the espresso machine, the gentle clink of spoons against ceramic, strangers laughing at nearby tables, while my world stopped spinning. 3 words. Just 3 words that somehow peeled back every layer I'd carefully constructed, exposing the raw nerve beneath. I sat frozen, my coffee cooling between my palms. This heated moment wasn't supposed to happen, not with someone I'd barely known for 3 weeks. Our conversation had veered from casual to confrontational in seconds, like rounding a corner to find yourself at the edge of a cliff. One moment we were discussing favorite films, the next he was looking through me as if I were made of glass. What are you talking about? I managed, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears. My carefully constructed identity, the version of myself I presented to everyone, family, friends, coworkers, the one designed to meet expectations, to avoid questions, to simply fit in, was suddenly under scrutiny by someone who had no right to see through me. No right at all. His eyes remained fixed on mine, not with judgment, but with a quiet understanding that felt more invasive than any accusation. Dark eyes, flecked with amber, when the light hit them just right, now studying me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I wanted to walk away, dig a trench and disappear, but found myself frozen to the wooden chair, as if leaving would somehow confirm whatever truth he thought he'd discovered. You know exactly what I mean, he said softly, his accent wrapping around the words. Every time we touch on something real, something that matters, about what you truly want, who you truly are, you deflect with humor or change the subject. You present this perfectly curated version of yourself. But it's not really you, is it? My throat tightened. Memories of our first meeting flashed through my mind. The bookstore, the accidental touch of hands, that first coffee where everything seemed so simple, so safe. How had we arrived here? That's ridiculous, I said, my voice sounding distant. You barely know me. Maybe, but I recognize the performance. He paused, taking a sip of his tea, his gaze briefly distant as if recalling his own stage. I performed too, for years. My fingers trembled against the wooden table, betraying the calm I tried to project. I tucked them beneath my thighs, hiding the evidence. You don't know what you're talking about, I insisted, but my voice lacked conviction, thinning under the weight of his gaze. The stranger across from me, who shouldn't matter but somehow did, tilted his head slightly, waiting for the truth I wasn't ready to acknowledge. His patience was unnerving. Most people would fill uncomfortable silences, backtrack, apologize for overstepping. Instead, he simply waited, holding the space, as if he had all the time in the world for me to drop the act. What had happened in those 3 weeks that gave this person the audacity, the insight to challenge my identity? We'd met for coffee 4 times, walked through a gallery once, texted about books and films. Superficial interactions that somehow led him to believe he had the right to unravel me. You've misread this entire, I started, then stopped as his eyes softened, not with pity, but with recognition. The first time we met, you spoke about your career with rehearsed enthusiasm. Your smile never reached your eyes. When I mentioned my hometown, you asked perfect questions but flinched when I asked about yours, deflecting to the weather. His voice remained gentle, but each word felt like a finger pressing against a bruise I didn't know I had. When our hands touched in the gallery, you pulled back like you'd been burned, then spent 10 minutes talking about the artist's technique, your voice pitched just slightly too high. I swallowed hard, heat rising to my face. The specificity of his observations left no room for denial. This wasn't vague psychoanalysis, but careful attention, the kind no one had ever paid me before, or perhaps the kind I'd never allowed anyone to pay. "Why do you care?" I asked finally, my defiance fading into genuine confusion, tinged with a desperate sort of hope. "Why does it matter to you how I present myself?" He considered this, turning his mug slowly, his brow furrowed for a moment. "Because I see glimpses of someone else beneath the performance. Someone fascinating, someone real. And because detachment is a lonely place to live. I know." The word real hit me like a physical force. When was the last time I'd felt real? When had I started building this carefully constructed self, layer by layer, year by year? And why did the idea of someone seeing through it terrify me so completely? "You don't know me," I repeated, but this time it wasn't a defense. It was almost a plea. "Don't make me face this." "No," he agreed softly, "but I'd like to." The simple honesty in those 4 words disarmed me completely. Outside, rain began to fall, droplets racing down the cafe window, distorting the street beyond into impressionistic blurs. I watched them, rather than the man who had refused the performance I'd perfected for years, the one that kept everyone, including myself, at a safe distance. "How?" I asked finally, the word barely audible. "How did you know?" A sad smile crossed his face, touching his eyes this time. "Because I spent years hiding too. Different reasons, perhaps, different stages, but the architecture of the walls, you recognize the signs when you've lived behind them." The revelation shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. This confident, self-possessed person with his easy manner and direct gaze, he had once been like me? It seemed impossible, yet I knew instinctively it was true. In our small corner table, cocooned by the rain and the gentle hum of the cafe, someone was being unmade and remade, while the mundane symphony of life continued around us. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat there being dismantled by his perceptive words. This man who now saw through every layer of my performance had entered my life through the most random of moments. Who would have thought that reaching for the same book as a stranger would lead to someone surgically dissecting the facade I'd spent years perfecting, the one designed to make me invisible in plain sight? 3 weeks earlier, I'd been standing in Blackwell's bookshop, lost in the quiet sanctuary of fiction. The store had always been my refuge, a place where I could disappear into other lives, safer lives. Afternoon light slanted through the windows, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air that smelled of paper and binding glue. When I spotted the last copy of The Boundaries Between Us, our hands reached for it simultaneously, fingers brushing against the spine. The unexpected contact with a stranger, this stranger, sent a jolt through me, far more than simple surprise, and I pulled back instinctively. I looked up to find myself staring into eyes that appeared almost amber in the bookstore lighting. They belonged to a man about my age, with features that suggested he wasn't from here. Something in the sharpness of his cheekbones, the warm undertone of his skin, an air of carrying other places within him. "I'm sorry," we both said simultaneously, then shared an awkward smile. I gestured toward the book. "Go ahead, please." My politeness was automatic, a well-rehearsed shield. He shook his head, his smile deepening to reveal a slight dimple in his left cheek. "You should take it. I've read it twice already." His accent wrapped around the words, authentic, worn at the edges, softening certain consonants and stretching vowels in a way that placed him somewhere across an ocean. "Twice? Is it that good?" I asked, surprised by my own willingness to continue the conversation, drawn by something in his open expression. "It's about being necessary," he replied with conviction that made me pause. The author understands something about identity and belonging, about the masks we wear, that most people spend their lives avoiding. I took the book, feeling the weight of its pages, the title suddenly feeling deeply personal. "That's quite the endorsement." "The protagonist reminds me of people I've met here," he continued, leaning against the bookshelf, seemingly comfortable in his own skin, in a way I envied. Always performing versions of themselves instead of simply being. His observation felt too pointed, too close to a truth I guarded fiercely. I shifted uncomfortably, my gaze dropping to the book spine. He sees it already. "I'm Emir," he said, extending his hand. His name rolled off his tongue with a musicality I couldn't replicate when I repeated it back during our introduction. His grip was firm, warm. "Where are you from?" I asked, defaulting to safe, standard questions. Istanbul originally, but I've lived in several places. He gestured toward the book. That's part of why that novel resonated with me. The author understands what it means to exist between worlds, between expectations. We stood there in the narrow aisle, surrounded by stories while beginning to create our own. He spoke about cultural displacement with animated hands that seemed to physically shape his thoughts. I noticed how his eyes never left mine when I responded, how he listened with his entire body turned toward me, a quality of attention I rarely experienced, and frankly, found slightly unnerving in its intensity. I'm here for a few months doing research, he explained, mentioning a visiting fellowship. The academic part is fascinating, but I'm finding the cultural experience even more so. How so? Where I come from, identity is often more fluid, more collective, though with its own strictures, of course. Here, everyone seems to have these carefully constructed individual personas, fortress identities. It's fascinating to witness. His observation caught me off guard again. It felt like he was somehow seeing through the careful architecture of my public self after just minutes of conversation. Does he see the fault lines? I'm getting coffee across the street, he said suddenly, his gaze direct and open. Would you like to join me? We could talk more about the book, or about fortress identities. He added the last with a gentle, knowing smile. I had perfected the art of polite refusal, of keeping people at exactly the right distance, yet something about his genuine expression, the lack of artifice, made me hesitate. My usual excuses felt flimsy, transparent. All right, I heard myself say, surprising us both. The rich aroma of freshly ground coffee welcomed us as we claimed a small table by the window at the cafe, the very same cafe where 3 weeks later he would dismantle those fortress walls. What began as casual literary discussion evolved into something profound as our conversation deepened through the afternoon. Emir spoke about literature, philosophy, and art with a perspective entirely different from mine. He described growing up with a concept of self inseparable from family and community, while I had been raised to celebrate individualism, often at the cost of connection. You speak about love and identity as if they're fixed categories, he observed gently. In my language, we have expressions that suggest these things are more like water than stone, always in movement, taking different shapes, finding new paths. I found myself defending viewpoints I had never questioned, arguments learned rather than felt. As he gently challenged each one, I realized how many of my perspectives were borrowed assumptions rather than lived truths, armor plating I'd mistaken for my own skin. I don't think I've ever heard these ideas framed like this, I admitted as our coffee cups emptied. Different starting points lead to different conclusions, he said simply, a hint of sadness in his voice, perhaps for the connections lost in translation between cultures. It's why I travel, to find the places where my understanding breaks down and needs rebuilding. 4 hours had passed in what felt like minutes. As we stood to leave, evening light casting long shadows through the windows, he asked if we might meet again. I said yes without hesitation, a small crack appearing in my fortress wall, not understanding that our next meeting would force me to defend beliefs I'd never examined and expose the emptiness behind many of my convictions. There's something terrifying about discovering the foundation of your identity might be built on borrowed ideas, especially when faced with someone whose entire concept of selfhood exists in a completely different dimension. Someone who seems to have navigated his own labyrinth of expectations. 2 days later, I found myself sitting across from Emir at a different cafe, tucked away on a cobblestone side street. The place was quieter, more intimate than our first meeting spot. I'd chosen it deliberately, thinking somehow the change of scenery might keep our conversation light, controlled. I couldn't have been more wrong. In America, you grow up thinking the highest achievement is to stand apart, I explained, stirring my coffee with unnecessary precision. We celebrate the individual who distinguishes themselves. That's success. Emir nodded in understanding, his expression thoughtful. And where I grew up, the person who stands completely apart is often seen as lost, or perhaps selfish. His words weren't accusatory, just matter of fact. When I was a child, my grandmother would tell me, "A finger alone can be broken easily, but a fist." He curled his hand into a demonstration. A fist has strength. There's safety and belonging, even if it sometimes feels. He searched for the word. Confining. But individual achievement drives progress. Innovation comes from those willing to break from the pack, I countered, the words flowing automatically from countless college seminars and societal mantras. Does it, though? His question was gentle but penetrating. Or is that the story your culture tells itself to justify valuing separation over connection? Perhaps true innovation comes from diverse minds connecting, not isolating. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. What I had was defensiveness, not a coherent argument rooted in my own experience. In my neighborhood, he continued, a faint wistfulness in his tone, families cooked together for Ramadan feasts. Neighbors, friends. The doors stayed open. Children belonged to everyone. When my uncle lost his job, the community provided without question. There was noise, chaos, intrusion, but also incredible warmth. That sounds smothering, I said, the word coming out harsher than intended, reflecting my own deep-seated fear of enmeshment. Why is interdependence seen as weakness in your world, while dependence on strangers you pay for services is freedom? His eyes fixed on mine, genuinely curious rather than judgmental. Perhaps both views missed something essential. The question hung between us, like a suspended bridge neither of us dared cross first. My mind assembled puzzle pieces of arguments that wouldn't fit together, defenses for a territory I suddenly wasn't sure was worth defending. When I arrived in the West, Emir said, leaning forward slightly, I noticed how people construct boundaries, physical and emotional. You make appointments to see friends. You ask permission to hug. Love itself is categorized, contained in relationships with clear rules and labels. Those boundaries protect us, I insisted. They create clarity, prevent misunderstandings. Or maybe they keep you isolated from experiences, from connections that might transform you, that might challenge those neat labels. His words sent ripples through my thoughts. I steered toward what I thought would be safer ground, something universal. What about romantic love? Surely that's universal. The desire for a special connection with one person. Emir smiled warmly, though a shadow passed through his eyes. In my language, we have different words for love that English compresses into one. Love for a friend, a parent, a lover, a stranger in need. They're variations on a theme with permeable boundaries. Ashk, sevgi, muhabbet. They describe different depths, different shades. Perhaps limiting it to one word, one primary form, narrows our capacity to feel. That's just semantics, I argued, feeling my ground slip. Is it? When your culture gives you one word for love but insists on rigid boundaries between relationships, doesn't that create artificial divisions in how you connect? Doesn't it sometimes force feelings into boxes where they don't belong, or leave some feelings unnamed, unacknowledged? For every point I raised about personal freedom or privacy, Emir revealed these weren't universal truths, but cultural constructs, ones I'd never examined because I'd never had to. My beliefs, previously as solid as bedrock, now seemed like sandcastles at high tide, beautiful but ultimately transient. By our third meeting, at a park where autumn leaves created a canvas of red and gold, these differences had become increasingly central. I'd mentally rehearsed arguments between meetings, gathering evidence for positions I suddenly felt compelled to defend, less out of conviction and more out of habit. Yet Emir never approached our conversations as debates to be won. His questions peeled away layers of certainty, inviting reflection rather than demanding agreement. Why did you choose your career? He asked as we walked along a tree-lined path, kicking through fallen leaves. Because I'm good at it. Because it allows me financial independence. It's respectable. The answers felt rote, rehearsed. Those are outcomes, justifications perhaps, not foundational reasons, he said softly, his gaze kind but unwavering. What would you choose if every path offered equal security and status? What truly draws you beneath the expectations? The question followed me for days afterward, echoing in the quiet moments. What would I choose without external validators? The salary, the prestige, the approval, the safety of the expected path? Did I even know myself without those identity markers? Did I want to know? With each conversation, a philosophical gulf widened between us. His worldview embraced fluidity and connection. Mine desperately clutched at categories and boundaries I was beginning to realize were borrowed clothes I'd been wearing so long I'd forgotten they weren't my own skin. And yet, across that gulf, I felt an undeniable pull. That gulf between us, those fundamental differences in how we saw the world, should have pushed me away, logically. Yet I kept finding reasons, however flimsy, to see him again. Have you ever noticed how the mind constructs elaborate defenses to protect the heart from what it truly wants, especially when what it wants feels dangerous or forbidden? I became an architect of denial, building walls of logic and intellectual curiosity while my body betrayed me with every quickened heartbeat when Emir's name appeared on my phone. with every involuntary lean towards him across a table. I convinced myself that our continued meetings were intellectual exercises, opportunities to sharpen my arguments, to understand a different perspective, perhaps even to prove my worldview superior. The truth, pulsing beneath my carefully constructed rationale, was far more frightening. I simply wanted to be near him. By our fourth meeting at a small Turkish cafe he'd discovered, fragrant with spices and strong coffee, something had shifted palpably between us, or perhaps within me. I noticed it in the way the afternoon light caught in his eyes when he leaned forward to emphasize a point, how his gaze would linger on mine a moment longer than necessary, sending a warmth spreading through my chest that I quickly labeled as discomfort. His hand occasionally brushed against mine when passing the sugar, each touch an electrical current I immediately cataloged as static shock or accidental proximity. These moments accumulated like evidence in a case I refused to hear. "You seem uncomfortable when we talk about connection," he observed gently during a walk through university parks. The spring air carried the scent of freshly cut grass, and students lounged on blankets in the distance. We'd found a bench near the river, and I'd instinctively positioned myself at the farthest edge, needing the physical space. "I'm perfectly comfortable," I lied, shifting even farther away. "I just think your perspective lacks pragmatism. It's interesting, academically, but not practical." His smile told me he saw through the facade, a gentle challenge in his eyes. "Is it pragmatism we're discussing, or is it fear?" I changed the subject, talking rapidly about a recent article I'd read. Another brick in my wall of avoidance. The physical reactions were undeniable, yet I became adept at mislabeling them, translating them into a language that felt safer. When our fingers touched as we reached for the salt, I attributed the jolt to surprise, the flutter in my stomach when he pronounced my name, slightly rolling the R and emphasizing the wrong syllable in that way that was uniquely his, became merely linguistic curiosity. My carefully rehearsed counter-arguments weren't truly to impress him, but to keep the conversation on safe, intellectual ground, to prove to myself this was nothing more than a meeting of minds. "It's just admiration for his intellect," I told myself firmly, "his different way of seeing the world. It's not the kind of connection I couldn't afford to feel." Each explanation, another hairline crack in the dam of my self-deception. When he dismantled my positions with gentle insight rather than aggression, I told myself my fascination was purely anthropological. How interesting to study his cultural framework. The intensity with which I sometimes argued back wasn't emotional investment, of course, but academic rigor. Yet each exchange weakened my defenses, like water seeping relentlessly through stone. I caught myself staring at my phone during meetings, waiting, a nervous energy thrumming beneath my skin. His voice would intrude into my thoughts at random moments, the specific way he'd phrased a question about identity, how he'd tilted his head when listening intently, the warmth in his laughter. I'd doodle Turkish words he'd taught me, arkadaş, friend, sohbet, conversation, during conference calls. The foundation of my certainty, my carefully ordered world, began to crumble. At night, I'd replay our conversations, meticulously focusing on my successful rebuttals while consciously pushing aside the moments his questions left me speechless, or the times his quiet understanding felt like a balm. I'd remember the curve of his smile when I surprised him with an unexpected observation, how his face transformed with delight at discovering a new facet of me. Not longing, I insisted fiercely to the darkness, just thorough mental record-keeping. The lie grew heavier, more suffocating each time. My friends noticed before I allowed myself to. "You mentioned that Turkish researcher again," my roommate pointed out over dinner. "That's the third time tonight. You get this weird light in your eyes." "He has interesting perspectives," I said defensively, stabbing at my pasta. "It's intellectually stimulating. And you check your phone constantly when we're out, even when it doesn't buzz," added another friend, raising an eyebrow. "Work emails," I muttered, feeling my cheeks flush, though we all knew my work wasn't that demanding. "You seem different," my sister observed during our weekly call. "Distracted, yes, but brighter somehow. Less guarded?" "It's nothing," I insisted, even as I paced my apartment, waiting for his message about meeting again, my carefully constructed calm fraying at the edges. I translated my body's increasingly insistent language into terms that maintained my precarious identity. Anticipation became intellectual engagement. Disappointment when our time together inevitably ended was merely the conclusion of a stimulating discussion. The reasons I found to occasionally touch his arm while making a point were just for emphasis, a normal part of communication. My elaborate explanations, a house of cards and a growing breeze. When he broke through my arguments with observations that cut directly to my core, I labeled my visceral discomfort as philosophical disagreement rather than the terror of being truly seen, perhaps for the first time. You speak about community as a concept, he said once, his gaze searching mine, but you flinch at the reality of genuine belonging, at vulnerability. Why? I had no answer that didn't threaten everything I thought I was, everything I had built to protect myself. After debating personal freedom versus communal responsibility for nearly 3 hours one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and purple through the cafe window, he walked me to my bus stop. Street lamps cast pools of gold light on the damp pavement. A comfortable silence settled between us, filled only by the distant city sounds. Tomorrow? He asked simply, his gaze holding mine. A war raged within me. The safe answer was no. The logical answer involved deadlines and responsibilities. But the truthful answer, I should be working, I said, the excuse sounding weak even to me, as I mentally rearranged my entire schedule. But you won't be, he replied, not as a question, but with a quiet certainty, a small smile playing on his lips. A breath escaped me, part sigh, part surrender. No, I admitted, the single word feeling momentous. I won't be. That small honesty, the first real truth I'd allowed myself about this connection, shifted something fundamental between us. His eyes met mine with an intensity that made me look away quickly, down at my shoes, afraid of what he might see reflected there, afraid of what I might see. I repeated my crafted narrative on the bus ride home. Intellectual curiosity, cultural exchange, rigorous debate, friends exploring ideas. But beneath those comfortable, threadbare explanations, a deeper, more resonant truth was forming. One I wasn't ready to name, one that threatened to unravel the very fabric of my carefully managed life. While I'd become an expert at translating my feelings into safer, more palatable alternatives, some moments transcend our ability to misinterpret or rationalize them. Standing before that painting in the quiet gallery, with our reflections merging like the figures on the canvas, I faced the moment when elaborate mental gymnastics and carefully constructed identities could no longer protect me from the undeniable truth of what was happening between us, and more terrifyingly, within me. The gallery invitation had come casually at the end of our fourth cafe debate, the one where I'd admitted I wouldn't be working. Emir mentioned an exhibition of contemporary Turkish artists that had traveled to the University Museum. You should see how we visualize some of the concepts we've been discussing, he'd said, eyes alight with that genuine enthusiasm that made refusing him feel like shutting a door on warmth and light. I agreed before I could formulate a plausible excuse. The museum was hushed and cool that Wednesday afternoon. Sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. We moved through the exhibits, Emir explaining cultural contexts and artistic intentions I wouldn't have grasped otherwise. His knowledge wasn't displayed boastfully, but offered generously, like a bridge between his world and mine. I found myself watching his hands as he gestured toward paintings, the way his fingers traced shapes in the air, somehow making abstract concepts feel tangible, reachable. This artist grew up not far from my old neighborhood, he said as we entered the final room. His voice had changed, grown softer, more intimate, drawing me closer. When I looked up from the placard to the canvas dominating the far wall, something inside me went utterly still. The painting pulsed with color and texture, bold strokes of deep, resonant blue and shimmering gold foil, applied with thick impasto that caught the gallery lights, creating valleys and peaks on the canvas surface. Two abstract human forms emerged from a shared, turbulent center, their edges indistinct, blurring into each other in the vibrant background. Neither figure was clearly gendered, neither entirely separate from the other. They existed in a dynamic state of becoming, either merging into one entity or painfully separating into two, impossible to determine which direction the transformation moved or if perhaps both were happening simultaneously. It radiated energy, conflict, and undeniable intimacy. "What do you see?" Emir asked, standing close beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, smell the faint, clean scent of his clothes mixed with the oil paint in the air. My mouth went dry. My practiced intellectual analysis failed me. "Just abstract art," I managed, the dismissal automatic, a pathetic shield against the painting's overwhelming power. But the artwork refused such a simple categorization. It pulsed with life, with a meaning that reached beyond the canvas to wrap around my consciousness, squeezing my chest. Is that all? His voice had dropped even lower, barely above a whisper, right beside my ear. The painting showed everything I'd been desperately avoiding. Connection without clear boundaries. Identity not as a fixed fortress, but as a fluid, evolving landscape. The terrifying beauty and potential pain of becoming something new, something unknown, through profound contact with another. My chest tightened with a recognition so acute it was almost physical pain. Emir shifted beside me, turning slightly until he faced me directly. Behind him, the protective glass covering the artwork caught our reflections. Two dark silhouettes standing close, our shoulders almost touching, overlapping at the edges just like the indistinct figures in the painting itself. The parallel was stark, unavoidable, exposing. The shadows of our forms merged against the luminous, turbulent canvas. "Is this what scares you?" he asked, his eyes holding mine with a gentle but unwavering intensity, an empathy that felt born of his own remembered fears. The gallery around us, the other paintings, the distant footsteps, seemed to fade into white noise. I felt transparent, utterly exposed, as though the careful walls I'd constructed over years had suddenly turned to glass, revealing everything I'd hidden even from myself. The longing, the fear, the unnamed desires. "I don't know what you mean," I whispered, but the lie felt thin and brittle, shattering even as I spoke it. "The artist calls this piece Becoming Through Another," Emir said, his gaze never leaving mine, holding me steady in the vortex of my panic. "She believes we only truly discover the contours of ourselves through deep connection with someone else, that identity isn't something fixed we must protect at all costs, but something fluid, something potentially beautiful, that we discover and shape through relationship." His hand moved slowly then, deliberately, until it rested palm up in the space between us, not grabbing, not demanding, simply offering. A choice presented without words, stark and terrifying and irresistible. The space between us, once a comfortable buffer zone, now felt like a vast, turbulent ocean I would have to brave to reach the offered shore. Time suspended, the air crackled. I stared at his outstretched hand, his strong fingers, the lines on his palm. Everything I'd been avoiding for weeks, for years, condensed into this single, potent moment of decision. The trembling began deep in my chest and traveled outward until my own fingers, hovering inches from his, visibly shook. I could still walk away, turn my back on the painting, on him, on this vertiginous feeling, could retreat behind the familiar, albeit suffocating boundaries I'd lived within for so long, could continue being the person I'd convinced everyone, including myself, that I was the detached observer, the controlled professional, the safe man. My hand moved, seemingly of its own accord, drawn by a force stronger than fear. When our fingers finally touched, skin against skin, the contact shot through my body with an intensity that stole my breath, grounding and electrifying all at once. It felt like recognition. Something inside me broke open, not violently, but like a tightly sealed dam finally giving way, a flood of feeling rushing through, painful and necessary and irreversible. Our palms pressed together, fingers instinctively intertwining. It felt right. In that single world-altering touch, the barriers I'd so meticulously maintained, between us, within myself, seemed to dissolve. I saw myself reflected in his dark, steady eyes, and, for perhaps the first time in my life, I didn't flinch, didn't look away. I saw not just fear, but a flicker of something else. Hope. Then the sheer magnitude of it, the vulnerability, the implication, the unknown future surged through me like pure panic. The dam breaking wasn't just relief, it was also terrifying chaos. I pulled my hand away abruptly, stumbling backward until my shoulder collided jarringly with the cool, solid wall of the gallery. The sudden emptiness where his hand had been was a physical ache. I need some air," I mumbled, my voice choked, already turning blindly toward the exit, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm sorry, I need to go." I fled the gallery, the quiet space feeling suddenly suffocating, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I didn't stop, half walking, half running, until I'd reached a worn wooden bench half a block away, collapsing onto it with lungs burning and thoughts scattered like shattered glass. What terrified me wasn't just Emir, or even the undeniable strength of what I felt for him. It was the stark, blinding realization that I didn't know who I would be if I acknowledged those feelings, if I let that connection in. If the boundaries I'd lived within weren't real, weren't necessary, then who was I? Who was the person beneath the performance? Was it someone acceptable, someone lovable? Who was I, if not the carefully curated straight man my family expected? If not the detached intellectual I performed for colleagues? What self remained when the performance ended, and what would that self want? The question echoed in the sudden, terrifying silence of my unraveling world. I pressed my palms hard against my eyes, seeing searing after images of the painting, of our overlapping reflections, of our hands joined between us. The physical memory lingered insistently in my fingers, the sensation of his skin against mine refusing to fade, a phantom touch promising both solace and upheaval. The after images haunted me, phantom sensations clinging to my skin, the echo of touch lingering long after the contact was broken. I spent 2 days avoiding his calls, the glowing screen of my phone feeling like an accusation each time his name appeared. Each unanswered ring felt like rebuilding a section of the wall he'd breached. What terrified me most wasn't him, not really, but the version of myself I glimpsed in that gallery. Raw, vulnerable, uncertain. Someone I'd spent years pretending didn't exist. Someone whose desires felt dangerous. Those gallery moments kept replaying in my mind, each scene more vivid, more potent than the last. I felt like a mask had slipped, perhaps shattered, revealing something I couldn't unsee, couldn't unknow. By the third day, a strange, fragile calm settled over me. The quiet after a storm is past, but before the full extent of the damage, or perhaps the potential for new growth, is assessed. The avoidance felt cowardly, unsustainable. I texted back, just 3 words. The usual place. No time, no pleasantries. An acknowledgement, a surrender of sorts. He would understand. The cafe felt different when I arrived. Smaller somehow, the familiar buzz muted, as if the walls had inched closer since our last visit. Or perhaps I was just more aware of the space between things. Emir was already there, his hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, steam rising between us like a fragile curtain. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, his voice lacking its usual easy confidence. He looked tired. Something in his posture had changed, a slight curve in his shoulders I hadn't noticed before, a vulnerability mirrored in his eyes that made him suddenly, startlingly human in a way that unsettled and reassured me simultaneously. He had risked something too in that gallery. "Why wouldn't I?" I asked, the question rhetorical as I slid into my seat, keeping my jacket on initially. An old habit, maintaining an exit strategy, keeping one foot perpetually out the door. When the silence stretched, thick with unspoken words, I finally broke it, needing to understand. "What exactly do you think you know about me?" My voice came out sharper than intended, a defensive edge I couldn't entirely smooth away, the last remnants of the fortress wall. Emir set his mug down carefully, his gaze meeting mine directly, but gently. "I know you feel like an outsider in your own life," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "Like you're watching yourself live it from a distance. I recognized it because I spent years feeling the same way." The words hit like a physical blow, knocking the remaining air from my lungs. This wasn't the accusation or judgment I'd braced for. This was recognition. "You?" The word emerged as barely more than a whisper. "But you seem so sure of everything, so comfortable in your own skin." A small, sad smile touched his lips, reaching his eyes this time, carrying the weight of experience. "Now, perhaps, more comfortable anyway. It's a process. But before." He traced the rim of his cup with his finger, his gaze distant for a moment. "Before I was a collection of performances, different versions for different audiences. The dutiful son my father demanded, the ambitious academic my professors expected, the easygoing friend, the man everyone assumed I should be. Hiding the parts of myself, the feelings, the questions that didn't fit the acceptable mold. I felt something shift beneath my ribs, a profound, resonant recognition that was almost painful in its intensity. He wasn't just seeing me. He was seeing a shared human struggle. "How did you stop?" I asked, the question vital, urgent. I slowly took off my jacket, hanging it carefully on the back of the chair, a small letting go. "It wasn't one dramatic moment," Emir said, leaning forward slightly, closing the distance between us. "It was many small surrenders, small acts of courage that felt huge at the time. First, admitting the truth fully to myself, without judgment. That was the hardest part. Then finding the courage to share it with someone I trusted, someone who wouldn't flinch. He paused, his gaze holding mine. Then gradually, learning to live more openly, letting the different parts of myself integrate instead of fighting each other. He told me more about his childhood in Istanbul, the complex tapestry of love and expectation, how his traditional father had mapped out his entire future, career, marriage, life. By the time he was 12, how he had excelled at becoming exactly what was expected of him, bearing his own artistic inclinations, his own questions about love and identity, feeling increasingly hollow inside with every achievement. I used to wake up some mornings, he confessed, his voice hushed, and stare at the ceiling, trying to remember which version of myself I needed to be that day. The mask felt heavier each year. I had perfected each role until I almost disappeared into them completely. The cost, he added quietly, looking down at his hands, was a profound loneliness, even when surrounded by people. I nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat. I had experienced that exact feeling, standing on a stage receiving an award, surrounded by applause and smiling faces, yet feeling utterly, terrifyingly alone. Playing a part no one had explicitly assigned, but everyone seemed to implicitly expect. As he spoke, vulnerably and honestly, I found myself sharing pieces of my own history I'd never voiced before. Not the dramatic secrets, but the quiet, corrosive truths. How I'd chosen my career as the path of least resistance, the sensible choice that pleased others. How I maintained friendships that skimmed the surface, never touching anything truly real or vulnerable within me. I dated people I thought I should want, I admitted, the words tasting strange and liberating on my tongue. People who fit the picture, who felt safe precisely because they never threatened to breach the walls, never asked the difficult questions, never demanded the real me I kept hidden. Emir nodded with quiet understanding, not pity, but empathy. We become experts at avoiding mirrors, he said softly, especially the ones held up by other people. Until someone holds one up anyway, I replied, meeting his eyes directly this time, holding his gaze, and refuses to let you look away. The cafe had begun to empty around us as afternoon bled into early evening, the low murmur of conversation a backdrop to our own intense exchange. We had been talking for hours, time dissolving as each tentative revelation, each shared moment of vulnerability chipped away at the remaining walls, bringing us closer, not just physically across the small table, but closer to some essential, shared truth. Tell me something real, Emir said, his voice low, almost a challenge, but gentle. Something you've never told anyone. I hesitated, my breath catching. My mind raced through layers of acceptable truths, searching for something authentic, something that mattered. Then I reached for the simple, foundational truth that had been waiting beneath the surface all these years. I began, my voice trembling slightly. I've never really felt at home in my own skin. Not truly. The words hung in the air between us, strange and fragile, yet powerful on my tongue. Admitting it felt like exhaling a breath I'd been holding for a lifetime. I've spent my whole life trying to find the right way to exist, I continued, the words flowing more easily now. The right person to be, the right things to want, when maybe there isn't one single right way at all. Emir reached across the table then, his hand open between us, not grabbing, just offering, solid, present. This time I didn't hesitate. I placed my hand in his, the warmth spreading up my arm, anchoring me. Our fingers laced together naturally, a quiet confirmation. That, he said, his thumb gently brushing against my knuckles, his eyes holding mine with profound softness, is the most honest thing you've said to me yet. Beneath all our apparent differences, culture, upbringing, personality, Emir and I were engaged in the same fundamental human struggle, the often painful, lifelong process of reconciling the people we were expected to be, the people we pretended to be, with who we actually were deep down. We were both, in our own ways, just trying to find our way home to ourselves, and maybe, just maybe, we didn't have to make that journey entirely alone. I fold the now creased napkin between my fingers, the paper soft and yielding. Evening light spills golden through the cafe window, catching the steam rising from Emir's fresh cup of tea. The past 3 weeks, or perhaps more accurately, the past few hours, have rewritten everything I thought I knew about myself, about the rigidity of the world I inhabited. Transformation, I realize, doesn't always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it works quietly, subtly, through tiny fractures in our armor. A piercing question we can't ignore, a gaze that refuses to look away, offering understanding instead of judgment. A touch that makes carefully constructed walls tremble and finally begin to crumble. Emir isn't a stranger anymore. He's not just the catalyst. He's become the mirror I desperately needed but was too afraid to seek, reflecting not just the cracks in my facade I once feared, but also the potential for something new, something more authentic, waiting beneath. As I watch him stir his tea, a quiet concentration on his face, I wonder, how many others walk through life wearing masks, performing versions of themselves, yearning for someone to see past the costume? The fear hasn't vanished entirely, but it's changed. It's no longer the paralyzing terror of exposure, but the nervous, exhilarating apprehension of stepping onto unknown ground. I'm no longer just afraid of the person waiting underneath my performance. I'm curious to meet him, intrigued even, and perhaps sitting here across from Emir, whose gaze now holds not just perception, but a shared vulnerability, a quiet warmth. I realize I might not have to meet him alone. He looks up, catching my eye, and offers a small, tentative smile, one that mirrors the fragile hope blooming in my own chest. The air between us feels different now, charged not with tension, but with possibility. The conversation isn't over. Maybe in a way, it's only just beginning.